Good afternoon, folks. Waiting for a couple people to join, and then we'll get started. We're at about 20 right now. All right, so I think maybe one or two more. Here we've got one more person, and then we're gonna get started. Just want to make sure everyone is aware. Today is a notes day, or a time where I'll be talking in class, and um, I would encourage you to follow along at what you think is going to be the best way for you to understand the content and the materials. This is on the bottom of your module that we've been on for a little while here. So I'm going to share the screen. And you should, if you go to chapters 10 through 13, see Aztec, 12, Aztec and Inca. And that's what I'm going to be working off of. All right. So if you guys want to download that and follow along that way, you can. I'm not going to make any changes to it. If you want to copy it, or if you want to print it off later or just take notes now, it's all up to you. Good. And I honestly am not going to be too nitpicky. This is quite a bit of information, though, again, like usual. So we got to get moving. And for those of you who signed on time and you have your video on, you're capable of doing that, I want to say thank you. If you do have a question, put your hand up in the hand raise function, and I'll try to get better at paying attention or seeing that. All right. So today we kind of shift focus in this time period of around circa 600 to 1450, but really 1000 to 1450 CE is what the AP test is going to be looking at. So I've got a little bit of a review, not a ton, but I want you guys to be able to put things in context. And so we moved from the Eastern Hemisphere over to the Western Hemisphere in the Americas. Okay. Prior to major civilization in the Americas, particularly the Aztec and the Inca, there are a couple of civilizations I want to just mention. These are not, I don't think they're in your textbook. If they are, there may be a paragraph or two and we skipped them, but they are standards on the AP test. So in North America in particular, and this is some stuff I think you've learned in middle school already, but in the Eastern Woodlands, you had the development of agriculture, not particularly like hardy agriculture or surpluses, but in the 3rd century BC, and people started to settle around the Mississippi River Valley, and that's where the Native American culture of the Hopewell Indians or the Hopewell Native Americans develops. Another great civilization that was actually really close to Indiana was known as Cahokia, and they were the mounds. They were a mound civilization, and it was believed that they traded with the Eastern Woodland Native Americans, and all the way as far south as possibly modern-day Mexico as well. Okay, and then in the West, you had a development of the Anasazi, okay, who lived by hunting and gathering and gradually learned agriculture by the 1st century CE. And some of you may have seen Anasazi communities in Southwest United States. And a good example of that would be Mesa Verde, if you've ever been there. It's a national park. Okay, so stateless societies, we call them, because they are not necessarily organized into the basic characteristics of a civilized society, okay, or a civilization. All right, so here's a better example for you. You'll notice they talked about the woodland farmers, Hopewell. You can see Moundville, and Cahokia. Actually, there's a city, and it's right off of the Mississippi River on your way to St. Louis, probably 7 to 10 miles before you get to St. Louis on the south side of the road. You maybe have seen it before. Also, then you can see the Pueblo Indians and the Anasazi and Mesa Verde I was mentioning. And there was trade between the two, but they never developed, like I said, into major civilizations. Okay, and then on the top northeast part of the map, you can see where the Vikings eventually, or the Norse, landed in what is today Canada, but didn't set up any permanent establishments. All right. As we move down into middle of America, or Mesoamerica, you can see, and if you guys read, you had various groups of people, the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Maya, and then eventually the Mexica, which would turn into what we would refer to as the Aztec. Okay. Now, a couple highlights of the Maya in the city of Teotihuacan. Okay. Teotihuacan would have been considered America's largest city prior to the rise of the Maya. It was actually north of present-day Mexico City. You guys can see this, but it was close to Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec. And there was where the Pyramid of the Sun was built. And you start to see the development of what the Aztecs will turn into a very rich and vibrant culture. And you start to establish these patterns of trade that happen in Mesoamerica with North America and South America. And these trade patterns go north-south. That's something I wanted you guys to write on your notes. The trade routes go north-south in the Americas instead of like the Silk Trade route, which goes east to west. Okay, I think that makes sense to you guys because of the way that they're shaped. All right, just a little bit on the Maya. Okay, the Maya actually went extinct, like I said, before anything you're really going to be formally tested on. But prior to 900 CE, they were a very elaborate culture on the Yucatan Peninsula. And I'll go back to show you guys in the green. Some of you have probably been to beaches close to Chichen Itza and maybe even gone there before. Okay, but they used swamp agriculture to grow surpluses. Had over 40 large cities with massive stone structures in these cities. And before they went extinct in what we call the Maya apocalypse, it was believed to be about 3 million people in their civilization, which is very large for the time. And their polytheistic set of gods and their cyclical view of the world through their calendar was copied by the Aztec. Okay, some of you have seen Chichen Itza before, about 100-foot pyramid. Okay, it's part of a huge complex called El Castillo, which just means the castle, because the Spanish were the ones that founded it and renamed it. The Maya had a writing system, unlike the Aztec or the Inca. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of it because they used a similar hieroglyphics type system that we had talked about in earlier civilizations, like in Mesopotamia with cuneiform and in Egypt. Okay, but we knew that they had a calendar, that they had a cyclical view of the world based off of study of the planets and of the sun. And there's accurate records of astronomical events that occurred during the reign of the Maya. Okay. And then between the 8th and 9th century CE, the Maya disappear. Okay. One of the reasons why is typically thought of as like their reliance on water and fresh water. They did have their own aqueduct type system, but over farming and over cultivation and a long drought caused them to migrate more into the swamps and like the mountainous land that had swamps in it, which is now central Mexico. Okay, where the Mexico we're from. All right. So just that was a brief background before 1000 CE. Now, between the fall of the Maya and you can see the rise of the Aztecs, which is much later, people are going to migrate from the Yucatan Peninsula over to, again, this lake in central Mexico, where you can see a bunch of different tribes that would create what is known as the Aztec civilization, but in reality is just what they called the Mexica. That was the tribe, and it was the group of these tribes that were around this central valley in modern-day Mexico. All right, so the rise of the Aztecs. Okay, Lake Texcoco was a large lake in the middle of central Mexico today, actually on the place of where Mexico City is today. But it was basically, it was called a lake, but it would be more considered like a swamp to us. If any of you have ever been to Lake Okeechobee in Florida, that might be a better example. You're talking about maybe 5 to 10 feet deep in most places and a lot of vegetation. And so it provided, once the tribes around it were able to farm, it provided a very good opportunity for them to grow food, which sustained a large population. Story has it, the feathered, or the eagle on the cactus here, as you can see, which is still on the flag of Mexico to this day, was the symbol that the Mexico would migrate here, and this would be their place of their empire and their capital city. And so the city of Tenochtitlan, okay, which is today modern-day Mexico City, was founded in the year 1325. Okay, it wasn't like they snapped their fingers and created a large civilization after that then. It wasn't until the mid-1400s that they're able to force all of the civilizations and all of the other tribes around them to pay them in tribute, which they then established themselves as an empire and no longer just one tribe. The Aztec king, again, as his position of emperor, looked at himself as the civil power and as a god and an intermediary between God and man. So, or the gods and man. So you might consider this to be, if you were doing a compare and contrast, almost a similar view that the Pope took when the Pope said that the Pope was infallible. Now, monotheism versus polytheism, of course, but still something for you to compare. All right, so the government of the Aztecs. There was a group of city-states that surrounded the lake, and they chose what was known as the speaker. And then the speaker turned into, over time, the emperor. And the emperor was seen as a representative of the sun god Huitzilopochtli, okay, the god. And I'll hopefully spell it here in a second. And obviously I have issues pronouncing it. Okay, so if I butchered that, it is what it is. Okay, it happens in this course. Now, as the Aztec grew and started to take over the tribes and established, in turn, kind of a larger empire, they didn't force local peoples that they took over to surrender to them. They just had them pay tribute or essentially pay either in grain shipments like corn, or sometimes in bodies, depending on what the tribute was for them to sacrifice. All right, so the gods that developed under Teotihuacan and under the Maya and the Olmec and the Toltec were the same gods that the Aztecs worshipped to, 128 in total. But the Aztec patron god and they basically the god of the cult of sacrifice and warfare was Huitzilopochtli. Again, it's on the screen. Don't. It's the second time I've said it. Wasn't even close to how I said it the first time. Yeah, I go to sleep trying to say this. Now, you can see the serpent here, the elaborate outfit, and this was a god that demanded it be sacrificed to. And so I put on here kind of the cult of warfare and sacrifice, because as the Mexica grew bigger and the Aztec took over the region, they started to identify the nobles as the people who were part of this cult of warfare and sacrifice. And thus they were the only ones that were allowed to participate in ritualistic ceremonies, sacrificing to the gods on the temple of the sun at Tenochtitlan. And this started to mean that if you were in this cult and you were a noble, you had to have bodies to sacrifice. So you had to go collect tribute from neighboring tribes, and that meant that you were always fighting these wars that we call flowery wars, which it's a cheesy name. The book uses it. I don't really go with the name flowery wars. I think of them as they use the word flowery because they weren't meant to kill, or take out an entire civilization. They were just meant to exert control over them and collect tribute. So they use the word flowery, but I look at it as just, it's pretty brutal. I mean, they're sending guys in to essentially take males, sometimes even kids, and kidnap them and then use them, fatten them up, and then use them as a sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli. All right. So, as was common with the Maya, human sacrifice became a very typical part of Mesoamerican religion, and they needed a continuous supply of human sacrifice in order to appease the gods. And so there are some practical purposes for this. I know you guys talk about this in middle school, I'm sure, and you're like, well, Mr. Brown already knew that. I get it. But take a look at the picture here and see the beating heart. We're going to look at a little video here in a second. But there's some reasons why this made sense. This area around central Mexico, to control it, because there was not originally one major tribe that dominated. The Aztec used the kidnapping and kind of these flowery wars to make sure that they were always able to appease the gods, but also they could politically control these areas and make sure there were no rebellions. Okay, that's one of the big reasons why when the Spanish showed up, the area tribes around the lake were like, yeah, we'll tell you all their secrets. We don't really like them that much. They don't really do too much for us. Okay. Another kind of common sense reason is population control. If you don't have too many people to feed, then you don't have to have too much food, okay? And so it's easier to exist. The third one then, a cannibal kingdom. There's a lot of speculation that the bodies were used to basically add protein into the diet of the people that lived in Tenochtitlan and in the noble classes, because if you remember right, when we looked at what animals were native to the Americas, you had the alpaca and the guinea pig. Okay, you got to slaughter a lot of guinea pigs to get a nice feast for you and your family at a big festival. But if you slaughter about 5 or 6 warriors, that's going to provide quite a bit more food for you, especially if you keep them in a cage and you fatten them up for 6 months, feeding them corn 7 times a day. Just think about what happens to Americans when they eat corn for every meal. Hasn't been good for us. High fructose corn syrup, Corn, 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 corn. Feed our cows and pigs with corn. Feed everything with corn. Yeah, you get the point. Okay. So, some again, part of sacrificing to the gods and appeasing them, but also again some common sense reasoning here. I think I got a video for you next. I do. All right, so this is about 3 minutes long. Call this a brain break. I got to see what time this class period ends. This is a funky day. Oh, wow. We don't have a ton of time. But, yeah, we'll go with it. It's all right. If it pulls up here.
This is a rendering of a human sacrifice being conducted by a 15th century Aztec priest. And if you're wondering whether the heart was still beating when they yanked it out of the victim's chest, the answer is yes. I wouldn't want to be the victim of a priest who was just learning how to do this, because I'm sure it took an awful long time for that person to die. But once the priest got pretty good, I imagine they probably went in and got the heart out 30 seconds. Aztec culture involved human sacrifice. Evidence indicates the Aztecs may have been murdering as many as 20,000 victims a year. I think the Aztecs had a terrific understanding of human anatomy. When they decided to sacrifice their victims, they knew it was going to be a lot easier to get into the chest cavity by making a hole in the abdominal wall and getting at the heart than trying to get through the breastplate, the sternum, and the ribs, which were very difficult to saw through. The victims were held down by 4 people, and the priest would take a knife while the victim was still alive, plunge it right into the abdomen, rip open the abdomen with the knife. They made a hole big enough to get their arm in, put their arm in, pierce through the diaphragm, pushing their hand up into the chest. And the heart is the only thing in the chest that's going to be going like this, and beating. It feels different than the surrounding tissue. The average adult human's heart is around the size of a small grapefruit and pretty much weighs around the same and has that kind of feel in your hand. So the priest would reach around until he felt the beating heart, grab onto it, and then just pull for all he was worth until he yanked it off its attachments. I have no doubt that the victim felt the priest's hands in his abdomen and the hand ripping through the diaphragm, which was, I am sure, exquisitely painful. And I have no doubt that the victim felt his heart being ripped from its attachments. But at that time, the victim would lose consciousness. The reason is, as the heart was being compromised, blood flow to the brain would stop. The brain just doesn't have the capacity to maintain consciousness without that blood flow. Most people think that if you pulled somebody's heart out of their body, that it wouldn't still be beating, but in fact, it absolutely would. The heart has what's called inherent rhythmicity, meaning that the muscle cells of the heart beat on their own and don't require input from the brain to beat. So if you get a heart out of a human body quickly enough, say within a few seconds, it absolutely will still be beating when you're holding it.
All right. Like I said, you maybe seen this before. It's not surprising to you, but we got a comment here. Yes. It is a bit violent, but I want you, this is why they get a bad rap, though, in history, because of the fact that they would fillet the skin off of these warriors they captured and killed, wear them around. The Spanish found skull racks, you can see on the upper right, and they found these pictures, and they automatically thought, wow, we have this civilization that is just, cannibalistic and into killing living humans. Just there's no way that that this could this could be a civilized complex society, which it really was. Okay. First off, the city of Tenochtitlan. I want you guys to get a good picture on the right. It was pretty impressive. If you see, there's bridges coming into it called causeways. That's another name of a bridge. And those bridges could at any point in time be taken down, essentially access restrained to them so that you could not get in and out of the city. In fact, Cortez and a lot of his men got stranded in the city because they took the bridges out once they figured out that they were trying to steal all their gold. It was literally located on an island that they continued to build on by essentially creating more vegetation and then putting in structures on top of that and building down into the base of the lake. And it boasted a population of 150,000 people on this island in the middle of the lake. Okay. And here you can see the Great Pyramid in the middle. But it also then was a canaled city. So people could take canoes throughout the city. And it was what do you want to call it? The very biased name of it is the Venice of the Americas. I might call Venice the Tenochtitlan of Europe, if we want to look at it in a less biased way. And I just got the same question. I thought I explained. Causeway is a bridge. That's like if you go out east, if you go to like North Carolina, you'll hear that term used a little bit more interchangeably. All right, so the Aztec economy was based off of growing corn. Okay, and so they grew corn in the basically on the islands, and then they started to grow what are known as chinampas. Okay, which were floating islands that they would use. They would put basically sticks on the corners of them, and then they would put reeds in the middle of them, and then they would build like a spongy type of vegetation, and then they would plant the corn on top of that in the lake, and now provided up to 6 yields of corn per year for the family that was taking care of these chinampas. We're lucky in Indiana to have one good yield of corn per year. Okay, you guys have probably heard the saying knee high by the 4th of July. Okay, go out now, the corn looks pretty good, but 6 times a year based off of the fact that they could grow them in these areas that provided nutrients for the soil and also provided sun because of its location to the equator. Okay, also then, the Aztecs had a lot more trade with other civilizations compared to the Inca. The Potecas were these long-distance merchants who would trade items all the way up as far as North America and into what would be now considered the United States, and then down into South America as well. And gold dust, cocoa beans, and sometimes feather plumes. So beautiful animal or bird feathers were used as currency, but most of the time it was just bartering. All right, so here's a picture of a chinampa, 17 feet wide, 100 to 300 feet. 17 feet long, 100 to 300 feet wide, and 20,000 acres of these in the lake, provided for a food base for this large population. Here's another good picture of it. You'll still see it, this lake has dried up and now is a concrete heaven for one of the largest cities in the world. But there's some examples of these that exist in Central America today. All right. Social organization, they're divided into 7 clans known as Kalpuli. And these nobles who were in charge of the Kalpuli then were the ones who were distributed land, maintained education, maintained the military. And then it was from these original 7 Kalpuli that the cult of sacrifice and war came from. And essentially the men who were part of this called themselves priests as well that were in this cult. All right. Women were relegated to grinding corn. Upper class women had some rights, as in inheriting like private property. But men for the most part still had the opportunity to have multiple wives, polygamy, and still was not close to a gender neutral or equal culture. Okay, I got to move on just so we can get to the Inca here. I got 12 minutes, I think. Yeah. All right. So the Inca came out of the Andes Mountains very close to the end of this time period. In fact, slightly after this time period, but they are going to rise to prominence coming from Peru and an area known as Cusco. Okay. And so, whereas they did not have a written language, Quechua was their spoken language. And some people who live in Peru to this day still speak Quechua. It's still around. It hasn't died. Okay. Most of it has been replaced by Spanish, obviously. But the people who lived in and around Cusco, in this very mountainous area known as the Alus, okay, they spoke Quechua, considered themselves to be kind of organized in this mountainous area, and they weren't really unified until the ruler Pachacuti unified them in 1438, where he then started this tradition of taking everything that he had with him, all of his earthly possessions, to the Temple of the Sun, which was called Machu Picchu. And subsequent emperors would follow the same practice, and thus you ended up with this massive temple complex. I think close to 10,000 feet high in modern day Peru, which is called Machu Picchu. Okay. Here, if you go to Cusco, here's a picture of Pachacuti, the Sapa Inca, or the first ruler of the Inca. All right. Here's Machu Picchu. We'll get more into it. But one of the most amazing things is this is when the Spanish never found this when they invaded in the early 1500s, and it lay pretty much by itself up until around 1900 CE. So these buildings lasted as they are for about 400 years. Now they're still renovating and kind of putting them back together how they looked, but this was a secret. This was the resting place of the Sapa Inca, or the ruler, and then all of his possessions with him, and even women to protect him and go with him, and even guards. They found quite a few bones of people that were sacrificed to go with the emperor in the afterlife. Okay, similar to the Egyptians, actually. Now, one of the hard parts about the Inca was they practiced a tradition known as split inheritance. Okay, and split inheritance was thus: if you died, your title, so your title of the emperor, Sapa Inca, went to your eldest son, but everything that you had conquered and the land and the wealth that you had conquered was, again, taken with you to Machu Picchu. And so what ends up happening is that next emperor then has to expand to get more tax base and more tribute. And then that's why you see the Inca expand across the Andes Mountains up and down north-south very quickly. They were very much affected by their terrain and animism as well, and they were polytheistic. And so the idea of mountains, rivers, and the resources that it could grow having an effect on their culture was pretty important. All right, so their government was split up into 4 provinces and run by nobles. And the nobles came from the original 10 Alus, which was around Cusco. Okay, obviously this became a problem when they got very, very large. So what they did was they allowed local rulers to stay in their positions of power. And what they did was they used a tax system known as the Meta system, where they would move conquered people around to serve various different functions. And then what that meant was they didn't, it would basically dissuade them from having rebellions and any type of problems, because they would continue to move people around to show that they were loyal. And then that served as taxes. It wasn't like money that served as a tax all the time. It was typically services. All right, so different than the Aztecs is they were fairly self-sufficient. They could grow their own crops, and they did trade and send things between their empire, but they didn't have a lot of outside influence from other civilizations. Even though they were located in the mountains, they were primarily agricultural. And if you've probably heard of terrace farming before, but they practiced terrace farming where they would make notches into the side of mountains, and they could get water then, which would seep through the steps of these notches and irrigate the entire side of a mountain. Okay, and then they would do that on the wet side of the mountain and not the dry side of the mountain. They would end up, the Inca would end up coming up with over 200 various types of potatoes. Some of you may have seen them before. Okay, here's an example. Okay, and I'm sure you knew this, but maybe you didn't. The potato is natural to South America. Okay, obviously not Europe. So French fries is a bit of a goofy term. All right, here's an example of terrace farming, which was done because of the lack of farmland. And this whole idea of Inca socialism, okay, and the Mita, okay, this was how they got work done. This is how they were able to maintain bridges, how they were able to maintain roads over a 3,000-mile long empire. They moved people that they conquered around, okay, to perform labor services they needed, and that was the tax, instead of having to pay, like I said, traditionally what peasants paid in grain or in some type of currency like gold or silver. All right. They did recognize parallel descent. This is one thing that women had a little bit more rights than the Aztec. Women were very, very good at weaving cloth, and Quechua, or like Peruvian cloth, to this day is, I've had kids bring into class many times. Beautiful cloth, and sometimes that would be their taxes. They would have to provide cloth for one of the Alus, or the noble families areas. Parallel descent, women would pass on their rights and their duty, like their jobs, to their daughters. Men would do the same thing. And so it wasn't just descent. It wasn't just like women died and it didn't matter. The male would pass everything on. It was parallel descent. All right. Some of the cool technology. I've got about a minute or two at most, and I'm going to explain what's tomorrow. Okay. Complex set of roads, 2,500 miles of roads. They did not have the use of the wheel, so they had to use runners in order to carry messages. And they didn't have large animals other than the llama. And so their messengers would run from station to station. They had these things called tambo stations, which were like modern day concept of a gas station. There they would keep food in these big cylinders, and there could be a military garrison there, so a runner could stay there for a night. Someone else would pass the message on, and that's how they were able to communicate. I already talked about their cloth, but they also had beautiful metalwork, bronze, gold statues. And then I'll show you a quipu. This is how they kept track of records, called a quipu. You've heard of this before. But Different colors represented different either regions. The knots represented a number. So this could represent 10. This could represent 100, 1,000, 10,000, etc. And that was how they determined records, because they did not have a writing system. There were certain people that were responsible for keeping the quipus. All right, and then lastly, this masonry right here that you can see is called dry stone masonry. This is one of the amazing wonders of how Machu Picchu is still there. Here you can see the roads, but this dry stone masonry, they created these buildings that lasted untouched for 500 years that had no concrete in between them in the mountains. All right, so this was the home of the emperor, Sapa Inca. Here's a bridge, a suspension bridge, still there to this day. They still have a festival. It's the only one that still exists. But you can see the strings and the knots. And then here's a good example of dry stone masonry. They moved these rocks by hand, cut them and chiseled them by hand without using a wheel, a large animal, or concrete to put in between in between the rocks, or like grout, like we use for tile today. Absolutely amazing. Here's another example of the road system, okay, of the number system of the quipu. And here's some some of the bronze and gold figurines that have been found. Okay, I know that was long, folks. Again, I like to only try to do that one time a week if I can. I'm getting the spinning function, but here's what I need you guys to see for tomorrow. Since Friday we have a test, we're going to jump into dividing this information up into themes for tomorrow. And I have on the board, see, that's, or not on the board, it's on a board, it's a screen. Have on the screen the number that you're responsible for. And so tonight, your job is to go through your notes, go through the textbook, go through my notes, and record everything that fits into this theme. Be ready to discuss it with your peers tomorrow for about 10 to 12 minutes. I expect people to participate a lot more tomorrow than we had last week. All right. That is the bell. That was my best attempt I could do at getting all of that in. Vivian Taylor asked me if I like talking about human sacrifice. I do think it's interesting. They actually cut the body up with obsidian since they didn't have access to like steel, and they used like volcanic rock called obsidian in their tools, and they still use those. Like surgeons still use that to this day, like on the tip of an instrument. It's made out of that volcanic rock because it can make it so sharp. But yeah, enough of that. The test over chapters 10 to 13 is on Friday. It's been on our syllabus for a month now, 3 weeks. It's open notes. Can't make a closed note test. All right, I've got other people coming from other classes, so I got to end this thing so that they can get on. If you guys have any other questions, send me a message, preferably on Canvas, but there's other ways as well. Okay? All right, be good, people. See ya.